December 2nd, 1985, Queens, New York. Inside a clean hospital room at Mary Immaculate Hospital. A man is dying. His once large body, which earned him the nickname, the Tall Guy, has grown weak from cancer. His strong eyes, which once made tough criminals look away in fear, are tired but still aware. Tubes and wires connect him to machines that beep steadily, marking the final hours of one of the most powerful and feared men in the American Mafia. This is not just any man. This is Aniello Dellacroce, boss of the Gambino crime family, a job he has held for 20 years. Outside his room, federal agents keep watch. Even now, as death comes near, they know what is coming. Everyone knows the person who has held the Gambino family together through years of internal fighting is about to be gone. 14 days, that is all it will take. 14 days after Dellacroce takes his last breath, his boss, Paul Castellano, will be shot and killed outside Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan in one of the boldest mob murders in American history. Coincidence? Impossible. Dellacroce's death will take away the one person who stopped an internal war. The one man whose word was law, whose loyalty was never questioned, whose very presence demanded respect from all sides. Tonight, we uncover the true story of Aniello Dellacroce, the man they called the Tall Guy, Father O'Neill, and the Executioner. A gangster so respected that even John Gotti, the man who would become the Dapper Don, called him teacher. A man who represented the last of a dying type, who lived by a code made in the old country and brought to the streets of New York. A man whose life covered the golden age of the American Mafia and whose death marked its beginning of the end. Before we dive into one of the most interesting stories in Mafia history, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Leave a comment below. If you love true crime and gangster history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And if you enjoy this story, give it a thumbs up. It helps us bring you more deep dive content like this. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To understand how a boy from Italy became one of the most powerful and feared mobsters in American history, the story of Aniello Dellacroce begins in mystery, as fits a man who would live his whole life in the shadows. The official record shows his birth date as March 15, 1914, but even his birthplace is argued. Some records say he was born in Veneto, Italy, in the northeastern part near Venice. Other papers suggest he was born in New York City, the son of Italian immigrants who had already made the trip across the Atlantic. What we know for sure is that Aniello Dellacroce grew up in the Little Italy part of Manhattan's Lower East Side, a neighborhood full of Italian immigrants, most of whom had left poverty in southern Italy and Sicily for the hope of America. His parents, Francesco and Antoinette Dellacroce, were part of the huge wave of Italian immigration that changed American cities in the early 1900s. The name Dellacroce itself is important. In Italian, it means "of the cross," a name that would be darkly ironic for a man who would spend his life in organized crime. Young Aniello, called Neil by his friends, grew up in a world where the old country's traditions clashed every day with America's promises and disappointments. Little Italy in the 1920s was a world of its own. The narrow streets between Mulberry and Elizabeth, from Canal to Houston, created a village inside a city. Italian was spoken more often than English. The smell of garlic and tomato sauce came from every apartment window. Men gathered at social clubs playing cards and drinking espresso. Women in black dresses leaned from fire escapes, calling down to children playing stickball in the streets. But Little Italy was also a neighborhood where surviving often meant bending the rules. The legal economy offered Italian immigrants mainly very hard work: construction, sanitation, factory jobs. The pay was poor, the hours were long, and discrimination against Italians was common. "No dogs or Italians allowed" signs were common. Newspapers often had cartoons showing Italians as criminals or simpletons. Young Neil Dellacroce grew up during Prohibition, which began in 1920 when he was just 6 years old. The Volstead Act, which banned making, selling, and transporting alcohol, created the biggest opportunity for organized crime in American history. It also shaped Dellacroce's view of the world and his career path in Little Italy. Prohibition was seen not as a law, but as a silly rule by a Protestant government that did not understand Italian culture. Wine had been part of daily life in Italy for centuries. Making wine in your basement was not a crime. It was tradition. This gap between what the law said and what the community believed created good ground for organized crime to grow. Neil Dellacroce grew up watching the neighborhood change. Secret bars appeared behind normal-looking storefronts. Trucks rumbled through at night carrying illegal whiskey. Men who had been poor suddenly wore expensive suits and drove fancy cars. The lesson was clear. The old-world values of hard work and patience did not pay in America, but cleverness, courage, and loyalty to your crew could make you rich. Dellacroce's school education ended early. Like many boys in Little Italy, he left school in his early teens to help support his family. But the streets gave another kind of education. He learned to fight, to read situations, to understand the complex order of respect and fear that ruled neighborhood life. He was tall for his age, with a natural physical presence that got attention. His eyes, dark and intense, had a quality that made people uneasy, as if he could see through their lies. By his mid-teens, Neil Dellacroce was running with a street gang, doing small crimes, theft, robbery, protection rackets targeting local businesses. His first arrest came in 1930 when he was 16 for theft. It was a small charge, but it marked his official entry into the criminal justice system, a system he would deal with for the rest of his life. The 1930s were a forming decade for both Dellacroce and the American Mafia. The early, wild years of Prohibition had given way to more organized structures. The major Italian crime families in New York had set up clear areas and leadership. In 1931, the Castellamarese War ended with the creation of the Commission, a governing group designed to settle fights between families and prevent the kind of bloodshed that brought unwanted police attention. In Manhattan, the leading family was led by Vincent Mangano, with his brother Philip serving as Underboss. The Mangano family controlled the Brooklyn waterfront and had big interests in labor racketeering, gambling, and loan sharking. Their group would eventually become known as the Gambino family. But in the 1930s, it was still building its structure and power base. Young Neil Dellacroce caught the attention of Mangano family members through his work on the streets. He had qualities that made him valuable. He was smart, ruthless when needed, but also able to hold back and plan. He understood that violence was a tool, not a goal. He could keep quiet, a very important quality in an organization where talking to police or outsiders could get you killed. Most importantly, Dellacroce understood the idea of omerta, the code of silence that was basic to mafia work. This was not just about not being a rat. It was about a whole way of thinking that put loyalty to your family, both blood family and crime family, above everything else. Above the law, above personal gain, above even your own safety. By the late 1930s, Dellacroce had been formally brought into the Mangano family. The exact date of his making, his formal start as a made member of La Cosa Nostra, is not recorded, but it likely happened in the late 1930s when he was in his mid-20s. The ceremony would have been traditional, pricking his finger, burning a holy picture in his cupped hands, while swearing an oath of loyalty. Being warned that betrayal meant death, the 1940s brought big changes. World War II disturbed the American Mafia's operations, but also created new chances. Dellacroce, like many young men his age, faced the draft. Though his exact military service record is still unclear, some sources say he served briefly. Others say he avoided service through connections or medical excuses. What is clear is that he continued his criminal activities through the decade. The 1940s saw Dellacroce developing his skill in several criminal businesses. Gambling became his specialty, running bookmaking operations, watching over illegal card games and dice games, handling the complex money arrangements that made these operations profitable. He learned the math of odds, the mind of gamblers, the importance of collecting money, and enforcement. Loan-sharking was another main business. Lending money at very high interest rates, sometimes called juice loans or Shylock loans, was very profitable but needed careful handling. You needed to judge who could pay and who could not, when to show mercy and when to use violence. Dellacroce proved good at this balance. He could be charming when collecting from a borrower who was struggling but trying, terrifying when dealing with someone who was avoiding payment. Labor racketeering also became part of his work. The Mangano family had deep connections to the Longshoremen's Union and other labor groups. Control of unions meant control of whole industries. You could demand payoffs from employers, steal from union pension funds, and use the threat of strikes as leverage. Dellacroce learned how these systems worked, building relationships with union officials and shop stewards, but it was as an enforcer that Dellacroce truly made his name. He was a capable, efficient killer, not a hothead who killed for fun, but a professional who killed when ordered or when needed to protect the family's interests. His methods were brutal when they needed to send a message, quiet when they needed to avoid attention. Bodies disappeared into the foundations of buildings being built, into the waters around New York, or were found in car trunks, each sending a specific signal to those who understood the language of mob violence. The most important relationship of Dellacroce's early career was with Albert Anastasia, the man who would eventually take control of the Mangano family through violence. Anastasia was already a legendary figure in the Mafia, the former head of Murder, Inc., the enforcement group that had carried out hundreds of contract killings during the 1930s and early 1940s. He was called the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner, nicknames that showed his violent reputation. Anastasia was Underboss of the Mangano family, serving under Vincent Mangano. But the relationship between boss and Underboss was tense and getting worse through the late 1940s. Anastasia was ambitious, violent, and more angry about Mangano's leadership. Mangano, for his part, feared Anastasia's growing power and independent operations. Dellacroce joined himself with Anastasia, a choice that would be crucial to his future. He saw that Anastasia was the real power in the family, a man who commanded the loyalty of the toughest crews. Dellacroce became part of Anastasia's inner circle, doing assignments, managing operations, and proving his reliability and skill. The values that Anastasia showed: fierce loyalty, personal courage, quick and firm action spoke to Dellacroce. Here was a man who had risen from poverty to become one of the most feared figures in the American underworld, through pure will and a willingness to do what others would not. Dellacroce took in these lessons, modeling himself on this example of the successful mobster. April 19th, 1951, Vincent Mangano disappears. His body is never found. His brother, Philip Mangano, is found shot to death in a marsh in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. The official story is that Vincent Mangano went into hiding, fearing for his life. The reality known to everyone in the life is that Albert Anastasia planned the murder of both brothers to take control of the family. This was a key moment in Mafia history and in Dellacroce's career. The commission, which was supposed to forbid the killing of a boss without approval, held a meeting. Anastasia said that Vincent Mangano had been planning to kill him, that it was self-defense. The commission accepted this explanation partly because they feared Anastasia, partly because they saw the Mangano family had grown powerful under his actual leadership, and partly because the other choice was a war nobody wanted. Anastasia became the official boss, and he rewarded the men who had supported him. Dellacroce, still in his late 30s, was promoted and given more responsibilities. He now led a crew of soldiers, made members who reported straight to him. His area grew, his ability to earn money increased, and his reputation grew. The 1950s were boom years for the Mafia, and Dellacroce did well. Post-war prosperity meant more money moving through gambling, more businesses to shake down, more chances for profit. Television brought new sports to bet on. The suburbs meant new construction projects to get into. The growing economy created more unions to corrupt. Dellacroce's crew worked mainly in Manhattan, keeping a strong presence in Little Italy and moving into other neighborhoods. His operations were varied. Bookmaking operations that took bets on sports and horse racing. Loan sharking networks that gave credit at rates that could reach 150% yearly interest. Protection rackets that insured businesses against vandalism and theft. Hijacking operations that stole goods from trucks and warehouses. During these years, Dellacroce built the reputation that would define him for the rest of his life. He was known as a man of honor, someone who lived by the old Mafia code. His word was his bond. If he promised protection, you were protected. If he promised payback, it came quickly and surely. He demanded respect and gave it to those who earned it, but he was also terrifying. His nickname, the Executioner, was not just a word. When Dellacroce was sent to handle a problem, the problem disappeared for good. He was not cruel. Those who knew him said he never seemed to enjoy violence, but he was completely ruthless. If killing someone served the family's interests, he killed them without pause or regret. Stories spread about Dellacroce's methods. There was the gambler who tried to skip town after running up huge gambling debts. Dellacroce tracked him to Florida, brought him back to New York, and made him pay every penny with interest while making it clear what would happen if he tried to run again. There was the union official who was secretly working with the FBI. He was found dead in his car, clear message to anyone else thinking of betrayal. There was the crew of robbers who hid a business under Dellacroce's protection. They were never seen again. These stories served a purpose beyond their immediate effect. They built a legend around Dellacroce, creating an air of certainty about his revenge. The best violence, from a mob point of view, is violence you never have to do because people are too scared to cross you. Dellacroce's reputation did much of his work for him, yet those who knew him well saw other sides. He was a devoted family man, at least in the normal sense of the word. He married Lucille Riccardi in 1939, and they had 2 children together, a son Armand and a daughter Shannon. He kept up the appearance of normal life, living in a modest home, going to family gatherings, playing the role of the hard-working businessman in his neighborhood. Dellacroce was respected, even liked. He helped people, giving money to families struggling with rent, finding jobs for neighborhood kids, solving arguments that might otherwise have ended in violence. This was not pure kindness. It was investment. Every favor created loyalty. Every problem solved created obligation. In a world where your power depended on how many people would stand with you. These investments were essential. October 25, 1957. Albert Anastasia walks into the barber shop at the Park, Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, for his morning shave. He settles into the barber's chair, a hot towel placed over his face. 2 men enter and open fire, killing Anastasia in a rain of bullets. The boss of the Mangano family, one of the most feared men in the Mafia, is dead. The murder shocked the underworld, but did not surprise it. Anastasia had been reckless, too violent even by Mafia standards, too independent. He had been running his own operations, including a plan to sell made member status to the highest bidder, breaking sacred traditions. Other families resented his power and feared his instability. The commission had approved his murder. The hit was done by members of the Profaci family, but the real planner was Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's Underboss. Gambino had been quietly building alliances, waiting for his moment. With Anastasia dead, Gambino moved fast to take control, and the commission approved his rise to boss. Where was Aniello Dellacroce during all this? The official record is silent, but mob historians have long argued about his role. Some think he was purposely kept in the dark, that Gambino knew Dellacroce's loyalty to Anastasia was too strong, and he could not be trusted with advance knowledge of the plot. Others suggest he knew, but stayed out, seeing that Anastasia's time had passed in opposing the hit would be useless and deadly. What we know for sure is that Dellacroce survived the change. This alone tells us something important about his character and political skill. After a boss's murder, a full cleanup is normal. The new boss gets rid of anyone who might keep loyalty to the old boss. Dellacroce not only survived, but did well under Gambino's leadership. This suggests he made peace with the new order quickly and convincingly. Carlo Gambino was a different kind of boss than Anastasia. Where Anastasia was impulsive and violent, Gambino was calculating and subtle. He preferred to work in the shadows, avoiding publicity and police attention. He was a diplomat, skilled at handling commission politics and keeping peace between families. Under his leadership, the renamed Gambino family would become the most powerful mafia group in America. Gambino saw Dellacroce's value immediately. Here was a capable enforcer and manager, someone who commanded respect on the streets and could handle violent, difficult men. Gambino raised him to capo captain, putting him in charge of a large crew that worked mainly in Manhattan. The relationship between Gambino and Dellacroce grew into something deeper than just boss and worker. Gambino became a father figure to Dellacroce, and Dellacroce's loyalty to Gambino was total. In many ways, they complemented each other perfectly. Gambino gave the big picture vision and political skill. Dellacroce gave the muscle and street trust that enforced Gambino's decisions. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, Dellacroce's power and influence grew. His crew was among the largest and most profitable in the family. He had crews working in Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx. His interests covered the traditional mafia businesses, but also moved into new areas, getting into legal businesses, corrupting labor unions, setting up connections with political figures who could be bought or scared. The Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy became Dellacroce's headquarters. The building was plain, a narrow storefront in a row of similar buildings. But inside, major criminal plans were made and carried out. The Ravenite became linked with Dellacroce, a place where problems were solved, where arguments were settled, where the business of the Gambino family's Manhattan operations was done. Men came to the Ravenite to ask for Dellacroce's okay for criminal plans, to ask permission to carry out hits, to settle fights with other criminals, to pay their share of their earnings. Dellacroce held court there, giving wisdom, making judgments, keeping order in his area. The FBI would eventually set up permanent watch on the Ravenite, seeing it as a key point in the Gambino family's operations. Dellacroce showed what was being called the old school, even while he was still in his prime. He believed in the traditional mafia values: omerta, loyalty, respect, honor. These were not just words to him. They were the basic principles that organized his world and his relationships. Omerta, the code of silence, was absolute. You never worked with law enforcement, period. You never testified against another made member. You never even admitted the mafia existed. This went beyond practical need. It was a point of honor, a test of character. In Dellacroce's view, a rat was not just a traitor. He was less than human, someone who had broken the most sacred bonds. Loyalty to the family came before everything. Before personal profit, before blood family, before life itself. When the family called, you came. When the boss ordered, you obeyed. This order of loyalty created a structure that could coordinate complex criminal operations and keep discipline. Across hundreds of members, respect was earned through shown ability and following the code. You respected those above you in the order, but you also demanded respect from those below. Disrespect could not be allowed because the whole system depended on keeping clear lines of authority and status. A made member who was disrespected by an associate or an outsider had the right, even the duty, to answer with violence. Honor, in the Mafia sense, meant living up to your word and keeping your reputation. If you made a promise, you kept it. If you took on a duty, you did it. If someone wronged you, you had to answer or lose face. This code of honor created predictability in a world without legal contracts or courts. Your word was your bond because your life depended on keeping your reputation for reliability. Dellacroce showed these values, and he enforced them ruthlessly within his crew. Members who broke the code faced serious results. Disloyalty meant death. Talking to police meant death. Disrespecting the family meant a beating or worse. But members who lived by the code were protected, made rich, and raised up. Dellacroce took care of his people, making sure they earned, backing them up in arguments, taking responsibility for their actions. This sticking to traditional values earned Dellacroce great respect, not just within the Gambino family, but throughout the Mafia world. Old-timers saw in him a link to the past, to the days when the Mafia was supposedly more about honor and less about money. Younger members looked to him as an example of what a mafioso should be. Tough, loyal, successful, feared. In 1965, Carlo Gambino made a decision that would shape the Gambino family for the next 20 years. He named Aniello Dellacroce as his Underboss, making him the second in command of what was now the most powerful mafia family in the United States. The promotion recognized Dellacroce's abilities and his loyalty, but it also served Gambino's strategic needs. The Gambino family was huge, with several hundred made members and thousands of associates. Managing such a group needed delegation, and Gambino needed someone he could trust to watch over day-to-day operations while he focused on big-picture leadership and commission politics. Dellacroce, now 51 years old, took on his new duties with his usual intensity. As Underboss, he was responsible for keeping discipline within the family, settling arguments between capos, watching over major operations, and serving as the main point of contact between the boss and the various crews. It was a tiring job that needed constant availability, careful judgment, and the ability to show authority. The Ravenite Social Club became even more important during this time. As Underboss, Dellacroce needed a place where he could hold court, where members could come to seek his advice or report on their activities. The FBI's watch of the Ravenite grew stronger. Agents photographed everyone who entered or left. They tried to plant listening devices, though these were often found and removed. They built thick files on Dellacroce's activities, connections, and habits, even though he was under constant watch. Dellacroce managed his operations with skill. He used anti-watch techniques, changing cars often, holding sensitive meetings in moving vehicles or in places that were checked for bugs, passing important information through trusted messengers rather than directly. He understood that the FBI was always watching, always listening, and he changed his operations to match. From the start of his time as Underboss, a split existed within the Gambino family. On one side were the Manhattan crews led by Dellacroce, old school, street-focused, centered on traditional rackets like gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. These crews were mainly Italian, sticking to traditional mafia values and methods. On the other side was a different group led by Paul Castellano, a relative of Carlo Gambino by marriage. Castellano's crews were more focused on white-collar crime, stock fraud, construction bid rigging, union pension fund trickery. Castellano himself was a businessman, running a meat processing company and other legal businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. He was educated, sophisticated, more comfortable in a boardroom than on the streets. The contrast between Dellacroce and Castellano could not have been sharper. Dellacroce lived modestly, dressed simply, and kept strong connections to the old neighborhood. Castellano lived in a mansion in Staten Island, a White Castle, that became known as the White House, dressed in expensive suits, and spent time with legal businessmen and politicians. Dellacroce's group saw Castellano's people with suspicion and dislike. They were white-collar guys, not real gangsters. They made money through trickery and fraud rather than through the courage and toughness that traditional mobsters valued. Castellano's group, in turn, saw Dellacroce's crews as dinosaurs. Too stuck in the old ways, too violent, too likely to bring police attention with their rough methods. Carlo Gambino handled this split carefully. He gave each group a lot of freedom within their areas of operation. Dellacroce watched over the Manhattan crews and the more traditional operations. Castellano managed the Brooklyn and Staten Island crews and the white-collar plans. Gambino settled arguments between the groups, kept the peace, and kept both men loyal to him. Personally, this balance worked. Because of Gambino's skill as a leader and because both Dellacroce and Castellano knew that their mutual loyalty to Gambino was greater than their differences with each other. But everyone understood that when Gambino eventually died or retired, the question of who would take over would bring these tensions to the surface. Would Dellacroce, the traditional Underboss and representative of the old school, take over? Or would Castellano, Gambino's brother-in-law and representative of the new business-focused approach, take leadership? Dellacroce's daily life as Underboss was a complex balancing act. He had to keep his own criminal operations going. His crews were still earning, still needed management and watching. He had to be available to solve problems throughout the family. He had to go to meetings with other families, representing the Gambino interests. And he had to do all this while under constant FBI watch and facing occasional legal trouble. A typical day might begin with a late breakfast at a restaurant in Little Italy, meeting with capos to discuss their operations and problems. These meetings were social but serious. Eating was a way to relax, to speak more freely, to keep the bonds that held the organization together. Over espresso and pastries, decisions would be made that decided whether someone lived or died, whether a business survived or was destroyed, whether thousands of dollars went one way or another. From there, Dellacroce might visit various places, checking out a gambling operation, looking at a newly entered union local, meeting with corrupt officials who were on the family's payroll. His presence served many purposes. It reminded people that they were responsible to the family. It let him gather first-hand information about operations and possible problems. It showed power and authority throughout his area. The Ravenite was where he spent most afternoons and evenings. Men would come asking to see him. Some to ask permission for criminal activities, some to ask for help in arguments, some simply to pay their respects and show their loyalty. Dellacroce would listen, ask questions, make judgments. His decisions were final. Arguing with him was dangerous. These sessions at the Ravenite showed Dellacroce's management style. He was direct and firm, impatient with excuses or unclear answers. He demanded detailed knowledge of his workers' operations, how much they were earning, what problems they faced, who they were working with. He was quick to spot inconsistencies or evasions in people's stories, and lying to him was very unwise, but he was also fair, by mob standards. If you were loyal, if you worked hard, if you showed respect, Dellacroce supported you. He protected his people from other families, backed them up in arguments, made sure they got their fair share of the profits. He understood that loyalty had to be two-way. You could not demand it from others unless you gave something in return. The nickname the Executioner was not just history. Dellacroce continued to order killings through his time as Underboss. Violence remained a needed tool for keeping control, enforcing discipline, and removing threats. The difference was that as Underboss, Dellacroce was now ordering hits rather than doing them himself. Some of these killings were internal. Discipline, a made member who broke the rules. Perhaps getting involved in drug dealing when it was forbidden, or showing disrespect to a superior, or most seriously working with law enforcement, would be killed. These murders served as warnings to others, strengthening the code and the results of breaking it. Other killings were business-related. A competitor who would not accept Gambino family control of a particular racket. A borrower who refused to pay and could not be scared. A witness who was a threat to members facing criminal charges. These murders were calculated, designed to solve specific problems with as little risk and as much effect as possible. The methods varied based on the message being sent. A member who had broken family rules might simply disappear. His body never found a sign that he had been judged and killed by his own family. A competitor or outsider might be killed in a more visible way. His body left where it would be found quickly, a warning to others. The specific details where the body was left, what condition it was in, whether the killing was made to look like an accident or was clearly a murder, all gave information. To those who understood the language of mob violence, Dellacroce was personally responsible for ordering dozens of murders during his career, possibly more than 100 over the decades. The exact number is unknowable. Many bodies were never found. Many deaths were never connected to the mob. And Dellacroce certainly never confessed to the full extent of his involvement. But FBI informants and later cooperating witnesses would describe him as one of the most productive killers in Mafia history, not in terms of personally pulling the trigger, but in terms of ordering deaths and watching over their doing. Despite this record of violence, Dellacroce never seemed to lose sleep over the deaths he ordered. Those who knew him described him as compartmentalized, able to separate his criminal activities from his personal life. He could order a man killed in the afternoon and then go home to have dinner with his family, seemingly untroubled. This ability to live with violence, to treat it as just a needed part of his business, was essential to his success in the Mafia. Understanding Aniello Dellacroce requires dealing with the contradictions between his public face and private life. To the outside world, he was a devoted family man. He lived with his wife Lucille in a modest home, keeping up the appearance of middle-class respectability. He went to family gatherings, played the role of the protective father to his children Armand and Shannon. He went to church at least sometimes, keeping up the look of Catholic respectability that was important in Italian-American communities. But behind this front was a more complicated reality. Dellacroce kept a secret second family with his mistress, a woman named Sandy Connors. With Sandy, he had 2 children. This was not unusual among mobsters. Many had mistresses and illegitimate children, but it was a major deception. A double life that needed constant management and secrecy. The existence of this second family raises questions about Dellacroce's character. Here was a man who preached loyalty and honor as absolute values. Yet he was lying to his wife for decades. He demanded truth from his workers while living a basic lie himself. This contradiction suggests that the code Dellacroce lived by applied within the Mafia, but not necessarily to his personal relationships or civilian life. The rules that govern his interactions with other criminals did not apply to his interactions with women or family. Those who knew both sides of Dellacroce described a complex personality. In his Mafia role, he was tough, firm, scary, the perfect gangster. But with Sandy and their children, he was apparently softer, more openly loving. With his legal family, he played the role of the traditional Italian father, in charge, provider, protector. These different faces suggest a man who adapted to different settings. While keeping an essential core identity, Dellacroce's relationship with money was also complex. Unlike many mobsters who showed off their wealth buying expensive cars and jewelry, wearing flashy clothes, Dellacroce lived fairly modestly. He did not need material displays to prove his status. His reputation and position did that for him. This holding back was partly practical, avoiding obvious shows of wealth reduced police attention, but it also showed a real old-world sense that saw showing off as rude. Yet, Dellacroce was earning huge amounts of money. As Underboss, he got a percentage of the earnings from all the Manhattan crews, plus his own operations. The money went somewhere invested in legal businesses, hidden in offshore accounts, given to family members, spent on keeping his various households. He was a wealthy man, but he wore his wealth quietly. His relationship with violence was perhaps the biggest contradiction. By all accounts, Dellacroce was capable of great warmth and loyalty to those in his inner circle. He helped people in his neighborhood, supported friends and family, showed real affection for his children. Yet, he could order a man's death without seeming regret, could see or take part in brutal violence without flinching. This ability to compartmentalize, to be both brutal and tender, cruel and kind, is typical of successful mobsters. But in Dellacroce, it seems to have been especially strong. As Underboss, Dellacroce watched over a criminal empire worth millions of dollars yearly. The exact numbers are impossible to know. The Mafia does not keep books that law enforcement can see. But based on court papers, FBI guesses, and later testimony from cooperating witnesses, we can sketch the broad outlines of his operations. Gambling remained a core business. The Gambino family controlled illegal bookmaking operations throughout New York City and beyond. These operations took bets on sports events, horse racing, and other contests. The bookmakers paid a percentage of their profits up the chain, with money eventually flowing to capos like Dellacroce and then to the boss. The gambling operations were sophisticated, using multiple phone lines and runners to avoid detection, keeping careful records to track bets and payouts, using enforcers to collect from debtors. The math of bookmaking made sure it was profitable. Bookies changed odds to make sure they made money no matter the outcome, charged high interest on credits, and used the threat of violence to make sure collections happened. A successful bookmaking operation could create hundreds of thousands of dollars yearly, and Dellacroce controlled many such operations. Loan sharking matched the gambling operations perfectly. Gamblers who could not pay their debts often borrowed money at very high interest rates, typically 150% to 200% yearly, sometimes more. The main amount had to be paid back in full. The weekly juice payments covered only the interest. Borrowers who could not pay faced growing consequences: harassment, beatings, threats to family members, and finally death or disappearance. The threat of violence made sure of a collection rate that legal lenders could never achieve. Labor racketeering gave both profit and power. The Gambino family controlled or influenced many unions: the Teamsters, longshoremen's unions, construction unions, garment worker unions. Control of a union meant multiple ways to make money: stealing from union pension funds, demanding payoffs from employers in exchange for labor peace, using union power to extort businesses, requiring kickbacks from union members for jobs or promotions. Dellacroce's crews were especially strong in the construction unions, which gave them huge influence over building projects throughout New York. Contractors who wanted to build in Manhattan often had to deal with Gambino family representatives, paying consultation fees or inflated prices for supplies, accepting union contracts with good terms for workers and kickbacks for union officials. This system took millions from the construction industry yearly. Hijacking remained a basic operation. Trucks carrying valuable cargo, cigarettes, alcohol, electronics, clothing were targeted. Sometimes drivers were in on the plan. Sometimes they were ambushed and forced at gunpoint to give up their cargo. The stolen goods were sold through fences or corrupt businesses at a fraction of retail value, creating big profits. Hijacking was risky. It could bring federal attention because stolen goods often crossed state lines, but it was also profitable and relatively easy to organize. Narcotics presented a complicated issue. Officially, the Gambino family under Carlo Gambino forbade drug dealing. The punishments were severe. Trafficking in drugs could get you killed. But the reality was more shaded. The ban was broken more than followed, especially by younger members and associates who saw the huge profits available in the drug trade. Dellacroce's position on drugs showed this complexity. He publicly supported Gambino's ban. Drugs brought heat from law enforcement. Addicted users became unreliable, and the punishments for drug convictions were harsh. But he also saw that many of his crew members were involved in the drug trade, and he seemed to have looked the other way as long as they were careful and continued giving money to him. This practical approach would later become a point of tension between Dellacroce's group and Paul Castellano's stricter enforcement of the drug ban. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the FBI's focus on organized crime grew dramatically. J. Edgar Hoover had finally admitted the existence of the Mafia after years of denial, and the Bureau made taking apart organized crime a priority. New investigative techniques, wiretaps, bugs, informants, long-term watch were used against the major families. The Gambino family, as the largest and most powerful, got special attention. And within the Gambino family, Aniello Dellacroce was a main target. His position as Underboss, his control of major operations, and his reputation made him a prized target for federal prosecutors. The FBI kept constant watch on Dellacroce. Agents photographed him entering and leaving the Ravenite Social Club. They followed him to meetings, recording his associates and activities. They tried to plant listening devices in his hangouts. Though these efforts were often stopped, mobsters had become smart about anti-watch, regularly checking their places for bugs and being careful about what they said in possibly compromised places. Despite this intense looking, Dellacroce proved hard to prosecute successfully. He was careful about what he said, avoided direct involvement in criminal acts when possible, and kept layers between himself and the actual doing of crimes. When his workers committed murders, extortion, or other crimes, they rarely, if ever, mentioned Dellacroce's name in intercepted communications. Evidence linking him directly to specific crimes was hard to find. This did not mean Dellacroce avoided legal trouble completely. He faced many charges over the years on various counts: tax evasion, loan sharking, labor racketeering. Some cases ended in convictions, others in acquittals or mistrials. In 1971, he was convicted of contempt charges and served a short sentence. In 1973, he faced racketeering charges, but the case was dropped. The pattern was one of constant legal pressure, but few serious results. The government won some battles, but could not deliver a knockout blow. Dellacroce's ability to avoid long prison sentences during his prime years was crucial to his power. Many mob bosses and underbosses spent long times in jail, which disturbed their operations and weakened their influence. Dellacroce stayed free and active, making his position solid and building his legend. Managing a criminal group as large as the Gambino family inevitably meant settling conflicts. Arguments came up constantly over area, over earnings, over respect and status. As Underboss, Dellacroce was the main judge of these conflicts, and his decisions shaped the family's internal workings. Some conflicts were straightforward. Two members claiming the same gambling operation or loan customer would come to Dellacroce for a solution. He would hear both sides, make a decision about who had the real claim, and his decision was final. These solutions kept order and prevented arguments from turning into violence that would bring police attention. Other conflicts were more complex, involving questions of respect and status. If a made member felt disrespected by another member, this could not be ignored. The whole system depended on keeping clear orders and enforcing respect. But answering every scene slight with violence would lead to chaos. Dellacroce had to judge when a slight was serious enough to deserve a violent answer and when it could be solved through other means, an apology, money payment, a public admission of wrongdoing. His reputation for fairness in these settlements was crucial to his authority. If he was seen as playing favorites, showing bias toward certain crews or individuals, his legitimacy as boss would weaken. Those who knew him described his approach as rooted in the traditional rules. Who had the right to claim a particular operation based on who had developed it? Who had priority based on rank and time served? What payment was right when someone was wronged? But Dellacroce could also be harsh when he felt someone was wasting his time with small complaints or trying to trick the system. He had little patience for weakness or complaining. You were expected to handle your own problems when possible, only bringing serious issues to his attention. Members who came to him too often with small arguments risked his anger. The most serious conflicts involved violence or possible violence between members. The rules were clear. You could not kill a made member without permission from the boss or Underboss. Breaking this rule could result in your own death. When conflicts grew to the point where violence seemed likely, Dellacroce would step in, sometimes ordering the sides to make peace, sometimes approving a hit if one side had truly wronged the other. Beyond repair. These decisions about life and death were made with a cold calculation. The question was not mainly about justice in any moral sense. It was about what served the family's interests. Would killing this person solve a problem or create a bigger one? Would it keep discipline or disturb operations? Would it send a needed message or bring unwanted attention? Dellacroce made these decisions based on decades of experience and an intuitive understanding of mob workings. In the mid-1960s, Aniello Dellacroce met a young would-be mobster who would eventually become the most famous gangster in America and play a key role in the Gambino family's future. John Gotti was in his mid-20s, ambitious, tough, and eager to prove himself. He had grown up in the rough streets of Brooklyn, done time for robbery, and was looking to make his mark in the life. Gotti was assigned to work under Carmine Fatico, a capo in the Gambino family who worked out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. Fatico reported to Dellacroce, and it was through this chain of command that Dellacroce and Gotti first connected. The relationship would prove to be one of the most important in both men's lives. Dellacroce saw something in Gotti that impressed him. The young man had courage. Certainly, he was willing to do violence without pause. But he also had charm, a quality not always valued in the mob, but increasingly important as the organization became more complex. Gotti could charm people, recruit them, inspire loyalty. He was a natural leader, though rough around the edges and impulsive. For Gotti's part, meeting Dellacroce was life-changing. Here was everything he wanted to be: powerful, respected, feared. Dellacroce became Gotti's model and teacher. Gotti took in Dellacroce's lessons about loyalty, about keeping respect, about the importance of the code. He tried to copy Dellacroce's manner, his firmness, his ruthlessness when needed. But there were key differences between teacher and student. Dellacroce, for all his violence, worked quietly. He avoided publicity, dressed simply, lived modestly. Gotti was flashy. He wore expensive suits, went to high-profile nightclubs, sought media attention. Dellacroce represented the old school that believed in staying in the shadows. Gotti represented a new generation that saw fame as a form of power. These differences would become clearer over time. But in the beginning, Dellacroce valued Gotti's potential and invested in developing it. He protected Gotti within the family order, backed him up in arguments, and gradually gave him more responsibility and freedom. When Gotti was charged with various crimes, Dellacroce made sure he had good lawyers and family support. When Gotti made money, he gave a share to Dellacroce, keeping the traditional money relationships that bound the organization together. Through the late 1960s and 1970s, John Gotti rose through the Gambino family ranks under Dellacroce's support. He became a skilled earner, developing hijacking operations and loan sharking businesses. He put together his own crew of loyal soldiers, many from his old neighborhood. Bound together by childhood friendships and shared experiences. In 1973, Gotti was involved in one of the most important episodes of his early career, the murder of James McBratney. McBratney had kidnapped and killed a Gambino associate, and the family wanted revenge. Gotti and two associates tracked McBratney to a Staten Island bar and shot him to death. The hit was successful, but witnesses saw the killers. Gotti was eventually arrested and convicted of manslaughter. He served less than 3 years in prison, a relatively light sentence for a murder charge, possibly due to behind-the-scenes influence. When he came out of prison in 1977, Dellacroce made sure he was brought back into family operations. This loyalty standing by a member who had gone to prison for family. Business was basic to mob culture and to Dellacroce's leadership style. In 1977, Dellacroce made a key decision. He supported Gotti for formal entry into La Cosa Nostra as a made member. This was a big honor, especially given Gotti's relatively short career and the murder conviction on his record. The ceremony would have been traditional: the pricking of the finger, the burning of a holy picture, the oath of loyalty. Gotti became a made guy with all the rights, duties, and protections that came with it. Dellacroce's support of Gotti showed his judgment that the younger man had the qualities needed for success in the life: courage, earning ability, and above all, loyalty. But it also showed Dellacroce's strategic thinking. He was building a group within the Gambino family, a network of capos and soldiers personally loyal to him. As tensions with the Castellano group grew, having strong, capable men on his side became more and more important. By the late 1970s, Gotti had become a capo himself, taking over the Bergin crew from Carmen Fatico. He was earning millions through various rackets, especially hijacking operations at Kennedy Airport. He was building his reputation as a tough, capable leader, and he stayed fiercely loyal to Dellacroce, seeing him as a substitute father figure, the man who had believed in him and raised him up. The relationship between Dellacroce and Gotti was complex, part teacher-student, part father-son, part mutual use. Dellacroce gained a powerful ally, a capable earner, and a street-level operator who could handle the violent, messy work that his position as Underboss made impractical for him to do directly. Gotti gained protection, guidance, and advancement in the order. Both benefited from the relationship, but it also bound them together in ways that would have deep results for the Gambino family. By the mid-1970s, a generation gap was becoming clear within the American Mafia generally, and in the Gambino family specifically. The old-timers, men like Dellacroce, who had grown up during Prohibition and the early organizational years of the American Mafia, represented one worldview. Younger members like Gotti represented another. The old school valued discretion above almost everything. You made your money quietly, avoided attention, did not show off your wealth or status. You dressed simply, kept a low profile, did your business in the shadows. This approach had served the Mafia well for decades, letting it work with relative freedom even as law enforcement knew about its existence. The new generation was different. They had grown up watching gangster movies, reading mob coverage in newspapers, seeing the glorification of outlaw culture. They were products of television and media saturation, and some of them wanted the attention and recognition that the old-timers avoided. They wore designer clothes, drove expensive cars, held court in trendy nightclubs. They saw themselves as celebrities, not shadows. This generation gap played out in practical ways. Younger members were more willing to take risks for bigger scores. They were less patient with the old traditions and orders. They disliked restrictions like the ban on drug dealing, seeing the huge profits being made by other criminal organizations and wondering why the Mafia was leaving money on the table. Dellacroce, despite being a traditionalist, had to handle this gap. His own crews included both old-timers who shared his values and younger members like Gotti, who had one foot in the old world and one in the new. He could not simply enforce the old ways through authority alone. He had to persuade, to show why discretion and patience served everyone's interests. His approach was to stress continuity while allowing for change. The basic values loyalty, omerta, respect for order were non-negotiable. But how you made money, how you presented yourself in the world, these could adapt to changing times as long as you earned, gave your share, and did not bring heat down on the family. Dellacroce gave his people a lot of freedom. This practical approach served him well, but also created tensions. Some old-timers felt he was too easy on younger members who broke traditional norms. Some younger members felt he was too rigid, too stuck in the past. Balancing these competing expectations needed constant attention and judgment. October 10th, 1976, Carlo Gambino dies of a heart attack at his home in Brooklyn. He is 74 years old and has led the Gambino family for 19 years, changing it into the most powerful and profitable criminal organization in America. His death creates a succession crisis that will shape the family's future and finally lead to its downfall. The logical successor, by traditional Mafia rules, should have been Aniello Dellacroce. He was the Underboss, a position that typically served as the step to boss. He had been loyal to Gambino for decades. He had the respect of the family's members and the fear of its enemies. He represented continuity with Gambino's leadership, but Carlo Gambino had other ideas. Before his death, he named Paul Castellano as his successor. The decision was controversial, but not surprising. Castellano was Gambino's brother-in-law married to his sister. He represented the business-focused approach that Gambino had increasingly favored in his later years. And perhaps most importantly, Gambino knew that naming Dellacroce would continue the old ways. While Castellano might modernize the family's operations, Gambino's decision put Dellacroce in an impossible position. By traditional Mafia rules, he had reasons to challenge the succession. The boss could not simply pick his successor, especially when it meant passing over the Underboss. The commission should have been consulted. Other family members should have had input, but challenging the succession meant civil war. It meant splitting the Gambino family into two groups, those loyal to Dellacroce and those loyal to Castellano, and fighting it out with guns. It meant deaths, federal charges, destruction of the carefully built organization. It meant betraying Carlo Gambino's last wishes, breaking the loyalty Dellacroce felt toward his teacher. Dellacroce faced the most important decision of his life. What he decided would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the whole Gambino family. For days, the mob world held its breath, waiting to see what the Underboss would do. Would he accept the humiliation of being passed over? Would he go to war? In the end, Dellacroce made a choice that surprised many. He gave in. He accepted Castellano as boss, staying as Underboss and keeping control of his Manhattan crews. The decision was shown as loyalty to Carlo Gambino's memory, honoring his teacher's final wishes even at personal cost. But it was also practical. Dellacroce was 62 years old. His health was failing, and a mob war might result in his death or imprisonment. The agreement came with conditions, though these were unspoken rather than formally negotiated. Dellacroce would continue running his Manhattan crews with a lot of freedom. Castellano would not interfere in his operations. The family would keep its dual structure traditional and modern, street and boardroom, with each group respecting the other's area. This arrangement kept the peace but planted the seeds of future conflict. Dellacroce had accepted Castellano's leadership, but many of his people had not. They saw Castellano as illegitimate, as someone who had inherited power through family connections, rather than earning it through ability and respect. They resented taking orders from someone they did not fear and whose values they did not share. Paul Castellano's leadership style could not have been more different from what the family had experienced under Carlo Gambino, where Gambino had been accessible, holding regular meetings with capos and keeping close contact with operations. Castellano was distant. He ruled from his mansion in Staten Island, requiring people to come to him. Where Gambino had been careful and subtle, Castellano was bossy, giving orders and expecting obedience without question. The contrast with Dellacroce was even sharper. Dellacroce stayed accessible, holding court at the Ravenite, keeping his connections to the streets. Castellano surrounded himself with his own group, doing family business from his home with a small circle of trusted advisors. Dellacroce lived modestly. Castellano lived in showy luxury. Dellacroce was respected. Castellano inspired little affection or fear. The policy differences between the two leaders created operational tensions. Castellano wanted to move the family away from traditional street crimes toward more sophisticated white-collar plans. He pushed construction bid rigging, stock fraud, and union pension fund trickery. These operations were profitable and attracted less law enforcement attention than traditional rackets. But they also needed different skills and offered fewer chances for the street-level soldiers who formed most of the family's membership. Most importantly, Castellano took a hard line on drug dealing. He announced that any family member caught dealing drugs would be killed, no exceptions. This policy showed both practical concerns. Drug convictions carried long sentences, and drug dealers often became informants, and his desire to raise the family's operations to a more respectable level. But Castellano's drug ban created a huge problem. Many Gambino family members, especially in Dellacroce's crews, were involved in the drug trade. The profits were simply too huge to resist. A successful drug operation could earn more in a year than traditional rackets earned in a decade. Young members saw their counterparts in other organizations getting rich from drugs and wondered why they should stay away. Dellacroce found himself in an uncomfortable middle position. He publicly supported Castellano's ban. He was still Underboss, bound to support the boss's policies. But privately, he knew his crews were dealing drugs, and he looked the other way. This practical approach kept peace but also created weakness. If Castellano learned about the drug dealing and forced the issue, Dellacroce would have to either crack down on his own people or defy the boss directly. The FBI, watching both groups carefully, saw the growing tensions. Their watch and wiretaps caught increasing complaints from Dellacroce's group about Castellano's leadership. They recorded meetings between unhappy capos, conversations about the situation, carefully coded discussions about the problem. That everyone understood meant Castellano, the late 1970s and early 1980s brought growing federal pressure on organized crime. New laws, especially the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations RICO Act, gave prosecutors powerful tools to target whole criminal organizations rather than individual crimes. Better watch technology, improved wiretaps, more sophisticated bugs made it easier to gather evidence. And a new generation of aggressive federal prosecutors was determined to take apart the Mafia. The Gambino family, as the largest and most powerful, got the most attention. Both Castellano and Dellacroce faced multiple charges. In 1984, Dellacroce was charged along with John Gotti and others on racketeering charges related to the operations of the Bergen crew. The charge detailed years of criminal activity, extortion, loan sharking, labor racketeering, gambling. The case was serious. Under RICO, prosecutors did not need to prove that Dellacroce had personally done specific crimes. They only needed to show that he was part of a criminal enterprise and that crimes had been done to help that enterprise. The evidence was substantial. Wiretaps, watch photos, testimony from cooperating witnesses. Dellacroce faced the possibility of spending his final years in federal prison. He was 70 years old, and his health was getting worse. He had been diagnosed with cancer though he kept the diagnosis secret from all but his closest family and associates. The idea of dying in prison, away from his families and his people, must have been devastating. But Dellacroce did not break. He did not cooperate. He did not consider a plea deal that would need testimony against others. The code he had lived by his whole life would not allow it. He prepared for trial, hired the best lawyers money could buy, and got ready for what would likely be his last battle. The trial was delayed multiple times due to various legal motions and Dellacroce's health issues. The cancer was progressing, though he tried to hide its effects. He continued coming to the Revenite, doing business, keeping his presence. But those close to him could see the decline, the weight loss, the tiredness, the occasional wince of pain quickly hidden. In the early 1980s, the drug issue that had been simmering within the Gambino family came to a head. Several members of Dellacroce's crews were deeply involved in heroin trafficking, including Angelo Ruggiero, one of John Gotti's closest friends and a member of the Bergin crew. The FBI had planted a bug in Ruggiero's home, and the tapes recorded extensive discussions of heroin dealing. This created a crisis for many reasons. First, it confirmed Castellano's worst fears about drug dealing in Dellacroce's group. Second, it put Dellacroce in an impossible position. Castellano could demand access to the tapes and then insist on killing everyone involved in drug dealing, which would include some of Dellacroce's closest associates and possibly John Gotti. Third, it broke Castellano's clear orders, which theoretically needed severe punishment. Castellano demanded that Dellacroce produce the tapes so the family could hear what was said and decide who needed to be killed. This was his right as boss to investigate and punish breaks of family rules. But Ruggiero and Gotti resisted, claiming the tapes contained damaging information that could be used against them in court. They refused to turn them over, a direct defiance of the boss's orders. Dellacroce was caught in the middle. He tried to help find a solution that would satisfy Castellano while protecting his people, but the situation was becoming impossible to maintain. The drug dealing was undeniable. Castellano's authority had been challenged. The standoff could not continue forever. Adding to the complexity was the FBI's obvious delight in the situation. They had created a split within the Gambino family, and they worked to use it. They leaked information about the tapes, filed motions in court that revealed damaging details, and generally did everything possible to widen the division between the Castellano and Dellacroce groups. By 1985, the Gambino family was teetering on the edge of civil war. Castellano's group saw Dellacroce's people as undisciplined drug dealers who were breaking sacred rules and bringing heat on the whole family. Dellacroce's group saw Castellano as a weak leader who had inherited his position rather than earning it, who did not understand the streets, who was making rules he had no authority to enforce. The only thing preventing open warfare was Dellacroce himself. His loyalty to the structure, his respect for the position of boss, even when he disagreed with the man holding it, his personal authority over his crews, these kept the peace. Everyone understood that this balance was fragile and temporary. Something would have to give. Through 1985, Dellacroce's health got worse quickly. The cancer was spreading, and treatments were either not working or refused. He lost weight dramatically. His once large body became thin, his energy faded. He could not keep the long days at the Ravenite that had been his pattern for decades. By fall, he could no longer hide his condition. He was hospitalized at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens, officially for treatment, but really because he was dying. The FBI kept watch even at the hospital, recording everyone who came to visit, trying to identify family members and associates, building their intelligence files even as their target lay dying. The visits showed the range of Dellacroce's influence. Old-timers came to pay their respects, to thank him for years of support and protection. Younger members came to see their teacher one last time. John Gotti was a constant presence, spending hours at Dellacroce's bedside. The dying Underboss had been his supporter, his protector, his father figure in the life. What did they talk about Dellacroce and Gotti during those final conversations? We can only guess. Certainly they discussed the situation with Castellano, the tensions, the drug tapes, the crisis facing the family. Did Dellacroce give Gotti his blessing for what would come next? Did he advise patience or action? Did he free Gotti from the loyalty oath that had prevented any move against Castellano while Dellacroce lived? The most likely scenario, based on later events and on what we know about Dellacroce's character, is that he kept his position to the end. He stayed loyal to the structure, to the concept of boss, even while recognizing Castellano's failures. He probably advised Gotti to be careful, to think strategically, to avoid rash action, but he also probably admitted the reality, with him gone, the protection Gotti and others enjoyed from Castellano's anger would disappear. They would need to make their own choices about how to answer. On December 2nd, 1985, at about 8:30 in the evening, Aniello Dellacroce dies at Mary Immaculate Hospital. He is 71 years old. The official cause of death is cancer, but in a deeper sense, he dies of being a dinosaur, the last of a type that cannot survive in the changing world of the 1980s. His death is front-page news in New York newspapers. Gambino Underboss dies, reads the headline in the Daily News. The coverage is extensive, telling of his criminal career, his position in the Gambino family, his reputation for violence and loyalty. The FBI releases statements about his criminal activities. Law enforcement officials show satisfaction that one of organized crime's most powerful figures has died, but in the mob world, the reaction is different. For those in the life, Dellacroce's death represents the end of an era. He was one of the last old-timers, men who remembered the Prohibition days, who had learned the life from the generation that had set up Cosa Nostra in America. His death cuts a direct link to the past, to the traditions and codes that had kept the organization going for decades. The wake and funeral are huge events, attended by hundreds. Made members come from all 5 New York families and families from around the country. Associates, friends, legal community members, they all come to pay their respects. The FBI photographs. Everyone who attends, building their intelligence files, recording the order and relationships within organized crime. John Gotti serves as one of the pallbearers. His face is a mask of grief. For him, this is personal. Dellacroce had been more than a boss. He had been a teacher, a protector, a father figure. With his death, Gotti loses not just a supporter within the family, but an emotional anchor, a connection to someone who had believed in him and raised him up. But Gotti's grief is mixed with something else, opportunity. With Dellacroce gone, the glue holding the Gambino family together has dissolved. Castellano is now free to move against Gotti and others in the drug tapes. The pretense of unity can no longer be kept. Decisions must be made, and they must be made quickly. The period between Dellacroce's death on December 2nd and what happens next is one of the most studied in Mafia history. During these 14 days, a conspiracy is finalized. Logistics are arranged, and a decision is made that will change the Gambino family forever. John Gotti does not act alone. He puts together a group of co-conspirators, all loyal to him personally, all from Dellacroce's group, all facing possible death if Castellano acts on the drug tapes. They include Sammy the Bull Gravano, who will later become famous as one of the highest-ranking mob turncoats in history. They include members of Gotti's crew from the Bergin, Hunt and Fish Club. The decision to kill Paul Castellano represents an extraordinary break of Mafia protocol. You do not kill the boss without commission approval. The results of unauthorized boss killing are severe, traditionally death for everyone involved. But Gotti and his co-conspirators calculate that they can present the commission with a fait accompli. If they move quickly and firmly, removing Castellano and taking control before anyone can react, The other families will have no choice but to accept the new reality. The planning is careful. They need to lure Castellano to a public place where he can be hit quickly and escape as possible. They settle on Spark Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, an upscale restaurant where Castellano has scheduled a dinner meeting. The location is perfect, busy enough that the shooters can blend in with crowds, but controllable enough that they can do the hit efficiently. They recruit a hit team, men willing to pull the triggers. They arrange for backup, for lookouts, for cars to be placed for escape. Gotti himself will be nearby watching, ready to take control immediately after the hit. Everything must go perfectly. There is no room for error. During these 14 days, one question haunts the planning. Would Dellacroce have approved? The man they had all followed, the teacher who had taught them about loyalty and respect for the structure, would he have allowed the killing of a sitting boss? Or would he have advised patience, urged them to find another way? The answer is unknowable. Dellacroce is dead, and whatever advice he might have offered died with him. But his absence is itself an answer. While he lived, his loyalty to the position of boss prevented any move against Castellano. With him gone, that restraint disappears. His death does not just remove an obstacle to killing Castellano. It removes the moral authority that kept the peace dot at about 5:25 p.m. on December 16, 1985. Paul Castellano arrives at Spark Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. He is with his underboss, Thomas Bellotti, who is driving. It is a cold December evening, already dark, and the streets are crowded with holiday shoppers and commuters heading home from work. As Castellano and Bellotti get out of their car, three men approach from different directions. They are wearing identical outfits, long trench coats, and Russian fur hats. A uniform that makes them memorable but also makes witness descriptions less useful since they all look alike. Each is armed with a semi-automatic pistol. The shooting is swift and brutal. The gunmen open fire at close range, hitting both Castellano and Bellotti multiple times. Castellano is struck 6 times and dies almost instantly. Bellotti, trying to come to his boss's defense, is also killed. The whole shooting lasts perhaps 15 seconds. The gunmen walk quickly away, disappearing into the crowds on 3rd Avenue. Within minutes, they are in cars driving away from the scene. Witnesses call 911. Police arrive, within minutes, to find 2 bodies on the sidewalk. Both dead, blood pooling around them. The scene is chaos, crowds gathering, traffic backing up, officers trying to secure the area and identify the victims. Within hours, the identities are confirmed. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, and Thomas Bellotti, his underboss, have been murdered in one of the boldest mob hits in New York history. The hit makes international news. "Mob boss rubbed out," screams the New York Post headline. Television news leads with the story. The execution-style murder of a mafia boss on a busy Manhattan street captures public imagination and creates intense media coverage. Photos of the bodies covered in sheets on the sidewalk outside the restaurant become iconic images of mob violence. But the most important moment happens blocks away from the murder scene. John Gotti, with Sammy Gravano, drives slowly past Spark Steakhouse after the shooting. They see the police presence, the crowds, the bodies. Satisfied that the hit was successful, they drive away. Gotti has just become, through violence and betrayal, the new boss of the Gambino crime family. In the days after the Castellano murder, the mob world holds its breath. Will there be payback from Castellano's group? Will the commission order the deaths of everyone involved in the unauthorized hit? Will there be a civil war within the Gambino family? Gotti moves quickly to make his power solid and prevent opposition. He meets with other Gambino capos, presenting the hit as needed to save the family. He argues that Castellano had broken Mafia traditions by trying to kill MAID members, those involved in the drug dealing, without proper reason. He claims that Castellano was about to be charged and might work with authorities. A false accusation, but effective propaganda. He promises a return to traditional values, respect for the soldiers, more chances for earning. Most crucially, he meets with representatives of the other New York families. The message is simple. The deed is done. Castellano is dead. Gotti is in charge. Opposing him now would mean war, and war serves no one's interests. The other families, practically recognizing reality, accept the situation. The commission does not formally approve Gotti's position. His break of protocol makes that impossible. But they do not oppose it either. Gotti becomes boss through force and fait accompli. Within the Gambino family, Castellano's group faces a choice: accept Gotti's leadership or go to war. Most choose acceptance. Some leave the life entirely, retiring or moving to other cities. A few die in mysterious circumstances, loose ends being tied up, possible opposition being removed. Within months, Gotti has firm control of the family. He raises his loyalists to key positions. Frank DeCicco, who helped plan the Castellano hit, becomes Underboss. Sammy Gravano becomes consigliere, the family's advisor. Capos who supported the hit are rewarded. Those who opposed it are pushed aside or removed. The Gambino family is remade in Gotti's image. But there is an irony in all this. Gotti claims to be returning the family to traditional values, to the old ways that Dellacroce represented. Yet the method he used to seize power, killing a sitting boss without commission, approval, broke the most basic tradition of all. The Mafia's structure depended on order, on rules about succession, on the commission's authority to settle arguments and prevent unauthorized violence. Gotti had shattered these norms. This question haunts any thought of the Castellano murder and Gotti's rise to power. Aniello Dellacroce was Gotti's teacher, the man who shaped his understanding of the life. Gotti claimed to be acting according to Dellacroce's values. But would the old Underboss have approved of killing the boss? The evidence suggests a complex answer. On one hand, Dellacroce's whole career showed loyalty to the structure. He had accepted Castellano as boss despite being passed over himself, despite disagreeing with many of Castellano's policies, despite the tensions between their groups. He had preached loyalty to the position of boss, regardless of his personal feelings about the man holding that position. This suggests he would have opposed killing Castellano, seeing it as a break of sacred traditions. On the other hand, Dellacroce was also practical. He understood power, understood that sometimes violence was needed to solve impossible problems. He knew that Castellano's strict enforcement of the drug ban threatened many lives, including possibly Gotti's. He saw that the Gambino family under Castellano was heading toward crisis, with the drug tapes and pending charges threatening to bring down the whole organization. Perhaps the most telling evidence is Dellacroce's timing. He held on to life through the fall of 1985, despite the cancer destroying his body, despite the pain and decline. Some who knew him believed he was literally forcing himself to stay alive. Knowing that his death would remove the last restraint on the conflict between Gotti and Castellano, he died on December 2nd. And Castellano was killed on December 16th, exactly 14 days later. This timing cannot have been a coincidence. The most likely explanation is that Dellacroce knew what was coming, and chose not to prevent it by dying when he did. He freed Gotti from the duty of loyalty that had held him back while Dellacroce lived. Dellacroce could not approve the hit directly, his code would not allow it. But he could step aside, removing himself as an obstacle. It was a final gift to his student, a silent admission that the old ways he represented were dying with him. John Gotti's time as boss proved none of the traditionalist talk he had used to justify his rise. Instead of returning to the old ways of discretion and shadow operations, Gotti became the most showy, publicity-seeking mob boss in American history. He wore $2,000 suits, held court at the Ravenite Social Club where Dellacroce had worked, organized 4th of July fireworks displays in his neighborhood. The media called him the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don, celebrating his celebrity status. This approach was the opposite of everything Dellacroce had represented. Where Dellacroce had been discreet, Gotti was showy. Where Dellacroce had avoided media attention, Gotti sought it. Where Dellacroce had dressed simply and lived modestly, Gotti showed off his wealth and status. The FBI naturally focused intense attention on Gotti. His high profile made it politically essential to bring him down. They planted bugs in the Ravenite, catching conversations that would eventually be used against him. They turned members of his inner circle into informants. Most importantly, they convinced Sammy Gravano, Gotti's Underboss, and the man who had helped plan the Castellano hit, to cooperate. Gravano's testimony was devastating. For the first time, a high-ranking mob figure was willing to testify in detail about the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra. He described the Castellano murder, confirmed Gotti's role, told of many other murders and criminal operations. His cooperation broke the code of omerta that Dellacroce had lived by. But Gravano argued that Gotti had broken the code first through his reckless leadership and disrespect for traditional values. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of murder and racketeering and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction represented a triumph for federal prosecutors, but also the beginning of the end for the Gambino family as a major criminal force. Gotti's celebrity had brought huge law enforcement pressure. His breaks of traditional protocol had weakened the loyalty and discipline that kept mob organizations going. His imprisonment created a power vacuum that led to internal conflicts and further prosecutions. Died in prison in 2002 of throat cancer, a disease strangely similar to what killed his teacher Dellacroce. By the time of his death, the Gambino family was a shadow of what it had been under Gambino and Dellacroce. Most of its leadership was dead or in prison. Cooperating witnesses had exposed its operations and membership. The old code of omerta had crumbled, with even high-ranking members choosing cooperation over death or imprisonment. How should we understand Aniello Dellacroce's life and legacy? He was, by any fair measure, a brutal criminal. He ordered dozens, possibly hundreds, of murders. He extorted businesses, corrupted unions, profited from gambling addiction and very high-interest loans. He helped build and keep going a criminal organization that caused great harm to individuals and communities. There is no way to romanticize or justify these activities. Yet, within the world he lived in, Dellacroce represented certain values that even now command a grudging respect. He was loyal genuinely, consistently loyal to his boss and his organization. He kept his word. He took care of his people. He lived by a code, even if that code served criminal ends. In a world of betrayal and treachery, his reliability was noteworthy. Dellacroce also represented a particular historical moment. He was a bridge between the old world and the new, between the Italian immigrant generation that had set up the American Mafia and the American-born generation that changed it. He kept connections to old country traditions while working in a completely modern criminal context. His career spanned the golden age of the American Mafia, from the Prohibition-era street gangs through the sophisticated criminal enterprises of the 1970s and 1980s. Modern mob historians see Dellacroce as a key figure in understanding the Gambino family's evolution. Under his management, the Manhattan Cruise became the family's muscle, its enforcement arm, its connection to the streets. His teaching of John Gotti, for better or worse, shaped the family's path in its final decades of power. His death removed the last restraint on conflicts that had been building for years, starting a crisis that finally led to the family's decline. The question of whether Dellacroce was the last man of honor depends on how you define honor. By the standards of the Mafia code, loyalty, courage, keeping your word, maintaining omerta, he certainly qualified. He never worked with law enforcement, never betrayed his colleagues, lived and died by the rules he had sworn to uphold. In this narrow sense, he had integrity, but this code existed to serve criminality and violence. Honor used to hurt innocent people, to extort businesses, to corrupt institutions. Is this really honor at all? Or is it just a romanticized version of organized brutality? The question has no easy answer, but it is worth asking as we consider Dellacroce's legacy, the New York that Aniello. Dellacroce lived and changed dramatically over his lifetime. The little Italy of his youth, a densely populated Italian area with its own language and customs, gradually disappeared. Italian Americans assimilated, moved to the suburbs, married people from other ethnic groups. The neighborhood itself was physically changed, with gentrification replacing tenements with expensive condos, traditional restaurants with trendy cafes. The Ravenite Social Club, Dellacroce's headquarters for decades, became a sort of tourist attraction. People would walk past, pointing out the location where mob business had been done, taking photos, discussing the history. The building was eventually sold and changed to other uses. The world that Dellacroce represented, insular, Italian-speaking, organized around old world loyalties, had vanished, replaced by something unrecognizable to someone of his generation. The broader changes in organized crime matched these neighborhood changes. The Italian Mafia's dominance gave way to a more diverse criminal landscape. Russian organized crime, Chinese triads, Albanian gangs, Latino cartels all competed for the criminal chances that the Italian mob had once controlled. The old area boundaries and agreed-upon protocols broke down. The Commission's authority, never formalized or legally binding, evaporated as new organizations ignored its rulings. Perhaps most importantly, the Code of Omerta collapsed. Beginning with Sammy Gravano's cooperation and speeding up through the 1990s and 2000s, high-ranking mob figures chose cooperation over imprisonment or death. Made members testified against their colleagues, wore wires, gave inside information. The foundation of Mafia power, the absolute ban on working with law enforcement, crumbled. Once that happened, the organizational structure could not keep itself going. Law enforcement strategy also evolved. RICO prosecutions let the government target entire organizations rather than individual crimes. Enhanced watch technology made it nearly impossible to do criminal business without leaving evidence. Longer sentences under stricter guidelines meant that even successful mobsters faced spending decades in prison. The risk-reward calculation that had made the Mafia an attractive choice for ambitious young criminals shifted decisively toward risk. By the early 21st century, the American Mafia that Dellacroce had helped build was effectively finished as a major criminal force. Families still existed in name, still did some operations, still brought in new members. But they were shadows of their former selves, working on the edges, unable to use the power and influence that had characterized them in Dellacroce's era. Aniello. Dellacroce died on December 2, 1985, but in a deeper sense, what he represented had been dying for years. The traditional Mafia, with its old-world codes and values, its order and discipline, its insular Italian character, this was already becoming outdated by the 1980s. Dellacroce recognized this. Perhaps in his final years, he saw the younger generation with their flashiness and their disregard for traditional discretion. He saw the drug epidemic tearing apart the old neighborhoods. He saw the changing ethnic makeup of organized crime. He knew that men like him were dinosaurs. His relationship with John Gotti showed this transition. Gotti was Dellacroce's student, shaped by his teaching, claiming to represent his values. But Gotti's actual leadership style broke everything Dellacroce had practiced. Where Dellacroce had been discreet, Gotti sought publicity. Where Dellacroce had been patient and calculating, Gotti was impulsive. Where Dellacroce had kept discipline and order, Gotti allowed chaos and eventually disloyalty. Perhaps Dellacroce understood that this was inevitable. The old ways could not survive in the modern world of all-around watch, RICO prosecutions, and changing cultural values. The Mafia's golden age had been based on specific conditions: insular ethnic neighborhoods, corrupt political machines, limited law enforcement abilities, and a cultural acceptance of certain forms of organized crime. By the 1980s, all these conditions were disappearing. In his hospital room in Queens in those final days, Dellacroce could look back on a remarkable criminal career. He had risen from the streets of Little Italy to become one of the most powerful mobsters in America. He had survived decades in the life, avoiding long imprisonment, keeping his position and power. He had built a group within the Gambino family that commanded loyalty and respect. He had taught the next generation, for better or worse. He had lived by his code until the end, but he could also see the future, and it must have been bleak. His student was about to break the most basic mafia rule by killing a sitting boss. The family he had helped build would be torn apart by the results. The code he had lived by would collapse as members chose cooperation over death. The neighborhoods he had known would disappear, changed by gentrification and demographic change. Everything he had built his life on was ending. We can imagine his final hours, though the specifics are lost to history. The hospital room, clean and bright, so different from the shadowy social clubs and back rooms where he had done his business. The machines beeping, marking his failing heartbeat. The morphine dulling the pain but also his awareness. Family members around the bed. Which family, though? His wife Lucille? His children from both families? His Mafia family? The men who had followed him for decades? John Gotti was there certainly, sitting by the bed, holding the old man's hand, receiving final words of wisdom or warning. What did Dellacroce say to him? Did he give his blessing for what was coming? Did he urge caution? Did he simply say goodbye, freeing Gotti from the duties of loyalty that had bound him? Other old-timers would have visited in those final days, men who had known Dellacroce for 40 or 50 years, who had come up through the ranks with him, who had survived the wars and the prosecutions and the changing times. They would have paid their respects, remembering old battles and old victories, the glory days that were now passing. And perhaps Dellacroce thought about Carlo Gambino, dead these 9 years, the boss he had served with absolute loyalty. Had he honored Gambino's memory by accepting Castellano as boss? Or had he betrayed it by allowing the tensions that would destroy the family Gambino had built? These questions, if they occurred to him, had no clear answers. The actual moment of death, when it came, was probably undramatic, a final breath. A long pause, then nothing. The machines would have made their sounds, alerting nurses and doctors. Family members would have wept. But for Dellacroce himself, it was simply an ending, the final payment for a lifetime of choices. Outside the hospital, the world went on, unaware that it had just changed. People drove home from work, worried about Christmas shopping and holiday plans. They had no idea that one of the most powerful criminals in America had just died, or that his death would set in motion events that would reshape organized crime in New York. But in the shadows, in the social clubs and the back rooms, in the places where mobsters gathered, the news spread quickly. Aniello Dellacroce was dead. The tall guy had fallen. Father O'Neill had taken his last confession. The executioner had faced his final execution. Use whatever nickname you preferred. They all meant the same thing. An era had ended. For the FBI agents who had chased him for decades, there was satisfaction mixed with frustration. They had fought him to a draw, essentially. They had never gotten the convictions that would have sent him to prison for life, never broken him or turned him, never truly defeated him. But they had outlasted him, and now he was gone. His criminal career ended by cancer rather than justice. For the men in the Gambino family, especially those loyal to Dellacroce, the feeling was loss mixed with fear. They had lost their protector, their patron, the man who had stood between them and Paul Castellano's anger. Without him, they were vulnerable. Decisions would have to be made, and made quickly. For Paul Castellano, sitting in his Staten Island mansion, the news must have brought relief mixed with concern. The old underboss who had been a constant check on his authority was gone. He could now make his control solid, remove the drug dealers in Dellacroce's group, remake the family in his image. But he must have also felt a twinge of unease. With Dellacroce gone, what would his group do? Would they accept Castellano's authority, or would they rebel? He had 14 days to find out. The story of Aniello Dellacroce is, finally, a story about the death of a particular kind of world. The old Italian-American neighborhoods, the immigrant communities that had kept old country traditions and values, these were disappearing even before Dellacroce died. Changed by assimilation and economic change and demographic shifts. The mafia that had come from these neighborhoods, that had been kept going by their insularity and their codes, was disappearing too. Dellacroce represented that dying world more completely than almost anyone else. He had been born into it, or brought to it as a child, had grown up speaking Italian, had taken in the old values. He had built his life around concepts honor, loyalty, omerta, respect that were rooted in Southern Italian peasant culture, brought to American urban streets, and adapted to criminal enterprises. These values had made the mafia powerful. The code of omerta made infiltration nearly impossible. The order and discipline allowed coordination of complex criminal operations. The emphasis on loyalty created bonds strong enough to risk death or imprisonment. For decades, these traditional values had kept one of the most successful criminal organizations in history going. But by 1985, the world had changed too much. The insularity that had protected the mafia now isolated it. The old neighborhoods were gone, replaced by suburbs where Italian Americans lived alongside everyone else. The code of omerta, which had seemed unbreakable, was cracking as members faced longer prison sentences and harder choices. The order and discipline were undermined by the huge profits from drug dealing, which made young members wealthy enough to challenge traditional authority. Dellacroce saw all this happening but could not stop it. He could enforce the old ways within his own crews, keep discipline and loyalty among his people. But he could not prevent the larger forces that were changing both the mafia and the world it lived in. He was King Canute ordering the tide to stop a futile gesture against inevitable change. His death marked the moment when the old world's last defender was gone. What followed Gotti's showy celebrity, the cooperation of high-ranking members, the successful RICO prosecutions, all of this had been held back while Dellacroce lived. His loyalty to the old code, his personal authority, his example of traditional values, these had kept the barbarians at the gate. With him gone, the gates opened. And that is the story of Aniello Dellacroce, a man who lived by a code from another era, whose death marked the end of the traditional mafia and the beginning of its most showy and finally self-destructive chapter. But to truly understand what his life and death meant, we need to step back and see the bigger picture of what died with him on that December evening in 1985. Aniello Dellacroce was born into a world that no longer exists. Whether he first saw light in the villages of Veneto, Italy, or in the crowded tenements of New York's Little Italy, he came from a specific historical moment, the great wave of Italian immigration. That changed American cities in the early 20th century. These immigrants brought with them not just their language and food, but entire worldview systems of honor and duty that had ruled village life in southern Italy for centuries. In those old villages, your word was your bond because there was no legal system you could trust. You protected your family and your friends because the government offered no protection. You settled arguments within the community because going to authorities meant betraying your people. These were not criminal values. They were survival strategies developed over centuries of foreign occupation, corrupt government, and grinding poverty. When these values crossed the Atlantic and met American prohibition, American urban poverty, and American discrimination against Italian immigrants, they changed into something new: the American Mafia. The Code of Omerta, the order of respect, the emphasis on loyalty. These traditional values were repurposed to organize and keep criminal enterprises going. What had been community survival mechanisms became the operating principles of organized crime. Dellacroce showed this change more completely than almost anyone. He lived entirely within the code. His loyalty to Carlo Gambino was not just practical calculation. It was genuine devotion, the kind of bond that in the old country might have existed between a peasant and his patron. His insistence on respect and order was not power tripping. It was keeping the social order that made their world understandable and predictable. His enforcement of omerta was not cruelty. It was preserving the basic rule that held everything together. This is why his relationship with violence was so complex and, to modern senses, so disturbing. Dellacroce could order a man's death without seeming regret, then go home and play the devoted father. He could be warm and generous to those in his circle, brutal and merciless to those outside it. This was not hypocrisy or psychopathy. It was the logical outcome of a worldview that divided humanity into insiders and outsiders, those bound by mutual duty, and those who were threats or tools, by the standards of his world. Dellacroce was indeed a man of honor. He kept his promises. He protected his people. He kept the code even when it cost him personally, as when he accepted Paul Castellano's rise over him. Despite having the better claim to leadership, he never worked with law enforcement, never betrayed a colleague, never broke omerta. He lived with integrity. If we define integrity as consistency between stated values and actual behavior, but here is the basic problem. These values, this code, this integrity, it was all in service of criminality. The loyalty he demanded enabled murder and extortion. The respect he commanded was built on fear and violence. The omerta he enforced let terrible crimes go unpunished. The order he kept exploited thousands of people, the gambling addicts, the desperate borrowers paying very high interest, the workers whose unions were corrupted, the businesses forced to pay protection money. So when we ask whether Dellacroce was the last true man of honor, we are really asking a deeper question. Can there be honor in service of dishonorable ends? Can integrity in following a bad code be considered genuine integrity? These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers. But they are worth grappling with as we try to understand this complex, contradictory, fascinating man. What is undeniable is that Dellacroce represented the end of something. He was among the last of the old-timers, men who had direct connections to the immigrant generation, who spoke Italian fluently, who kept ties to the old country's traditions and values. When he died, a living link to the Mafia's origins died with him. The men who came after, even those like John Gotti, who claimed to represent traditional values, were fundamentally different. They were American-born, English-speaking, shaped more by American media and culture than by Italian village traditions. This generational transition was inevitable and irreversible. The old ethnic neighborhoods that had kept the Mafia going were disappearing, changed by urban renewal, white flight to the suburbs, and demographic change. Little Italy, which had once housed hundreds of thousands of Italian immigrants, shrank to a few tourist-oriented blocks. The insular, Italian-speaking communities that had provided both recruits and cover for mob operations simply ceased to exist. The values were changing too. The code of omerta, which had seemed unbreakable, began to crumble. The turning point came after Dellacroce's death, with Sammy Gravano's decision to cooperate against John Gotti. Gravano was a MAID member, a high-ranking Underboss, exactly the kind of person who should have been most committed to the code, but he chose cooperation over death or life imprisonment. And in doing so, he he opened the floodgates. Once one high-ranking member broke omerta and survived. Others followed. The foundation of Mafia power, the certainty that members would never talk, crumbled. Law enforcement strategy evolved too. RICO prosecutions let the government target entire organizations rather than prosecuting individual crimes. This was devastating because it meant that even bosses who never personally did violence, who kept layers between themselves and actual crimes, could be held responsible for their organization's actions. Enhanced watch technology, better wiretaps, more sophisticated bugs, comprehensive camera systems made it nearly impossible to do criminal business without leaving evidence. Longer mandatory sentences meant that members faced decades in prison, making cooperation more tempting. The economic calculation changed as well. In Dellacroce's prime, the Mafia offered chances for wealth and power that were not available through legal means for working-class Italian Americans facing discrimination. But by the 1980s and 1990s, Italian Americans had largely assimilated. They could become doctors, lawyers, business owners without facing the barriers their grandparents had met. The Mafia's recruitment pool dried up as fewer young men saw organized crime as their best option for success. Perhaps most fundamentally, the culture changed. The Mafia had always depended on a certain level of community tolerance, a sense that while mob activities might be illegal, they were not entirely illegitimate. Neighborhood people might disapprove but would not actively work with police. This tolerance weakened as the Mafia's activities became more visible and more destructive, especially with the spread of drug dealing and the violence it created. All of these forces, demographic change, cultural assimilation, legal evolution, technological advancement, were coming together in the 1980s. Dellacroce could not stop them. No one could. The world that had created the American Mafia and kept it going for decades was disappearing. Men like Dellacroce were dinosaurs, and they knew it, even if they could not fully say what was happening. This context makes the question of whether Dellacroce would have approved of John Gotti's takeover particularly poignant. On one level, the answer seems obvious. No, he would not have approved. Killing a sitting boss without commission approval broke the most basic Mafia protocol. It was the kind of act that in an earlier era would have resulted in certain death for everyone involved. Dellacroce had preached loyalty to the structure his whole life. He had accepted Castellano's rise despite being passed over himself. Consistency would suggest he would oppose Gotti's move. But on another level, maybe Dellacroce understood that the old rules no longer applied, because the old world that had created those rules was gone. Castellano represented a different Mafia corporate, cautious, disconnected from the streets. His ban on drug dealing, while defensible on practical grounds, ignored the economic reality that drugs were where the money was. His bossy leadership style alienated the traditional street crews that had always formed the Mafia's backbone. His White House mansion showed how far removed he had become from the neighborhoods that had spawned the organization. Gotti, for all his flaws, was a product of those neighborhoods. He understood the streets in a way Castellano never could. He commanded genuine loyalty from his crew, not just obedience based on position. He was willing to take bold action rather than cautiously calculating risks. In some ways, he was more like Dellacroce than Castellano ever was, even if his flashy style broke the old man's sense of discretion. Perhaps in those final conversations, Dellacroce gave Gotti something like a blessing, not explicit approval for killing. Castellano, his code would not allow that, but a release from the duty of loyalty that had held Gotti back while Dellacroce lived. By dying when he did, by removing himself from the equation, Dellacroce let events unfold that he could not approve but also could not prevent. It was a final act of practicality from a man who had always balanced principle with practicality. The tragedy is that Gotti's reign proved none of the traditionalist values that Dellacroce had represented. Instead of returning the family to old-school principles, Gotti became a celebrity gangster, courting media attention, showing off his wealth and power, working in ways that attracted massive law enforcement attention. His time as boss was brief and disastrous, ending with his conviction and life imprisonment and the beginning of the Gambino family's decline as a major criminal power. So, Dellacroce's death marked not just the passing of a man but the end of an era. The traditional mafia, secretive, disciplined, organized around old world values, died with him. What came after was something different. Flashier, more chaotic, finally unsustainable. Within a decade of his death, the Gambino family would be devastated by prosecutions. Within 2 decades, the American Mafia as a major criminal force would be effectively finished. Standing here now, nearly 40 years after that December evening in Queens, we can see Dellacroce's life in its full historical context. He was a bridge between 2 worlds, the old country and America, the immigrant generation and their assimilated children, the Mafia's golden age and its decline. He kept traditions that were already becoming outdated, enforced codes that would soon be abandoned, showed values that would not survive in the changing world. Was he a hero? Absolutely not. He was a criminal who enabled tremendous harm, who profited from others' suffering, who used violence as a routine business tool. Was he a villain? Yes, but a complex one shaped by specific historical circumstances, working within a moral framework that, however twisted, had its own internal logic and consistency. Was he the last man of honor? Only if we are willing to admit that honor in service of terrible ends is a deeply problematic concept. What we can say with certainty is this: Aniello Dellacroce lived a life that matters for understanding American history. The story of the Mafia is part of the story of immigration, of urban development, of how ethnic communities adapted to American life, of crime and law enforcement, of power and violence, and loyalty and betrayal. His life shows all of these themes, and his death, followed so quickly by the Castellano murder and the chaos that followed, marked a clear historical break, the moment when one kind of organized crime ended and another, briefer, more self-destructive form began. So what do you think? Was Dellacroce the last true man of honor? Would he have approved of Gotti's takeover if he had lived? How should we understand a man who lived by a code of loyalty while ordering murders and running criminal enterprises? Can there be integrity in service of crime? These questions do not have easy answers, but they are worth considering as we reflect on this remarkable, terrible, fascinating life. The world that created Aniello Dellacroce is gone. The neighborhoods have changed. The codes have been broken. The organizations have crumbled. But the story remains a window into a vanished world, a cautionary tale about the limits of loyalty and the price of living outside the law, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, humans create systems of meaning and value, however twisted those systems might be. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through one of the most compelling stories in Mafia history. The tale of Aniello Dellacroce reminds us that history is complex, that people are contradictory, and that the most interesting stories resist simple moral judgments. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into Mafia history and true crime stories that explore the complex, violent, fascinating world of organized crime. Check out our playlist for more gangster stories that will help you understand this crucial chapter of American history. Until next time, stay curious, and good night.